Chapter 1. The Icy Threshold. The wind howled with a ferocity that seemed to shake the very bones of the earth, and the snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, obscuring the world beyond the small cabin. Outside, the Arctic night stretched for endless miles, an expanse of glistening white, broken only by the jagged peaks of ice that towered like ancient sentinels in the vast wilderness. It was a cold that could crush a man's spirit, a frozen silence that could drive even the most resolute to madness. Inside, the warmth of the fire crackled, though it did little to banish the creeping chill that clung to the walls. The expedition team had gathered, each man lost in his thoughts, eyes darting from the flickering flames to the heavy door which seemed to groan in protest against the storm. Among them sat Hercule Poirot, his meticulous figure poised at the corner of the room, studying his companions with a gaze that seemed to penetrate the very heart of each of them. His sharp eyes missed nothing, the way their breaths quickened when the storm howled louder, the shift of weight from foot to foot, the nervous tugs at collars as if the cold were creeping into their very souls. The team had set out on what was supposed to be a ground-breaking scientific expedition to the Arctic. Their goal, to uncover the mysteries of ancient ice formations and gather data that would change the world's understanding of climate patterns. But now, in this remote, isolated cabin, the real mystery was not the ice, but the men surrounding him. Each one of them had a secret, a history they were reluctant to share. It had all begun with a letter. An invitation to Poirot, written in the elegant script of a celebrated scientist, Dr. Klaus Richter, who was leading the expedition. The letter had promised adventure, discovery, and perhaps even a chance for Poirot to engage in some intellectual challenge outside his usual realm of human deceit and treachery. What the letter had not warned him about was the storm, this unforgiving monster that had trapped them in a desolate cabin far from any sign of civilization. Poirot adjusted his collar, his eyes glinting with the firelight as he surveyed the team. Dr. Richter, the leader, a man of impressive intellect, but whose arrogance shone through every word and gesture. Edgar McConnell, the scientist with a passion for geological formations, whose temper flared easily when challenged. Anne Sims, the enigmatic woman whose quiet demeanor seemed to mask an undercurrent of tension. And then there was Viktor Ivanov, the Russian geologist, who preferred silence and had a way of studying everyone with a gaze that sent chills through the others. Poirot had spent only a few days in their company, but already he sensed that the dynamics within the team were as dangerous as the frigid landscape outside. They spoke of the expedition as a scientific mission, but Poirot could see the cracks, hidden motives, personal grievances, unspoken jealousies lurking beneath the surface. And, he suspected, there was more to this journey than the desire for discovery. Just as the storm outside seemed to reach its crescendo, there was a sudden noise, a thump, from the direction of the storage room where supplies were kept. The entire team froze, their heads snapping towards the source of the sound. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Something was amiss. Poirot's lips curled into a small smile. It was as if the universe had conspired to present him with a puzzle. The tension in the room thickened, but he remained composed, his gaze unwavering. There was no immediate danger, but Poirot knew that this was only the beginning. Something was about to unfold, something that would reveal the true nature of those around him, something that would challenge his intellect in ways he had not anticipated. As the fire flickered, casting long shadows across the room, Poirot's mind began to churn. This Arctic expedition, this team of brilliant yet flawed individuals, had more in common with a set of intricately carved chess pieces than he had initially realized. And in every chess game, there was always a move that changed everything. It was time to make his move. Chapter 2. The First Clues. The storm raged through the night, its fury seemingly unending. The small cabin groaned under the pressure, the wind whistling through cracks in the walls. Inside, the expedition team huddled near the fire, each man lost in his own thoughts, their uneasy glances betraying a sense of discomfort that even the warmth could not dispel. Poirot sat quietly, his hands resting neatly on his lap, his eyes never straying far from the others. He had already assessed each of them, cataloguing their movements, their mannerisms, the subtle shifts in their behavior. Yet there was one thing that caught his attention, a peculiar tension in the air that seemed to intensify with each passing moment. It was as if something was about to happen, though what exactly he could not yet discern. Suddenly a loud crash echoed through the cabin. Everyone jumped, their eyes darting to the source of the noise. It had come from the storage room, the same place where Poirot had heard the thump earlier. Without a word, Dr. Richter stood and moved towards the door, his steps deliberate but stiff. The others followed, their expressions a mix of fear and confusion. Poirot, however, remained seated, his gaze fixed on the door. The tension in the room was palpable, thickening with each passing second. As the others crowded into the storage room, Poirot remained behind, his mind racing with possibilities. What had caused the sound? Was it a sign of something more sinister, or merely the cabin settling under the weight of the storm? It didn't take long for the group to return. Dr. Richter's face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief. He seemed shaken, his usual composure faltering for the first time since Poirot had arrived. "What happened?" Poirot asked, his voice calm, his eyes sharp. "It's gone," Dr. Richter replied, his voice tight. "The supplies, the crates of equipment we had stored, they're gone." Poirot's eyebrows rose ever so slightly, though he made no comment. The room fell silent as the others exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the revelation settling heavily over them. "What do you mean, gone?" Viktor Ivanov asked, his voice gruff. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Dr. Richter snapped, his impatience evident. "The crates! Completely gone! Vanished!" Poirot rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate, as he walked toward the door of the storage room. The others watched him, their expressions a mix of curiosity and apprehension. As Poirot stepped into the dimly lit space, he immediately began to observe the surroundings. The door had been left ajar, the only evidence of disturbance being the scattered boxes and a faint trail of footprints in the snow outside. Poirot knelt down, carefully inspecting the tracks. They were too faint to distinguish any specific details, but they were enough to tell him something crucial. Someone had left the cabin, and in such a hurry they had not bothered to cover their tracks. The footprints led to the back of the building, disappearing into the surrounding snowdrifts. He rose to his feet and turned back to the group. "Someone has taken the supplies. It is clear that they did not wish to be seen." "Who would do such a thing?" Anne Sims asked, her voice trembling. Her eyes flickered nervously between Poirot and the others. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind working furiously as he considered the implications of the theft. This was no ordinary crime. There was something deliberate about it, something planned. Whoever had taken the supplies had known exactly what they were doing. They had made sure to leave no trace, and yet the very act of their disappearance spoke volumes to Poirot. "It is not the theft of the supplies that is most interesting," Poirot said softly, his voice carrying a note of quiet certainty. "It is the fact that it occurred at this moment during the storm. The question is not who took them, but why now? Why wait until we are cut off from the outside world?" The group remained silent, each person lost in their own thoughts. Poirot's gaze shifted from one to the next, his mind continuing to work as he considered the possible motives. He could see the subtle shifts in their expressions, their discomfort, the nervousness that had crept into their features. It was clear that no one in the room was unaffected by the events. Poirot turned his attention back to the footprints outside, studying them for a moment longer before turning to face the others. "We must continue with our investigation," he said, his tone firm. "But let us not be fooled by appearances. There is more to this than a simple theft. The true mystery is yet to be revealed." With that, he made his way back into the cabin, leaving the others to their thoughts. The storm raged on outside, but Poirot's mind was already working, weaving through the web of clues and contradictions that had begun to unfold before him. The game had begun, and he would not rest until he had uncovered the truth behind this enigmatic crime. The first clues had been laid bare. It was only a matter of time before the entire puzzle came together. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. The evening passed slowly in the small cabin, the only sounds the constant howling of the storm outside and the occasional crackle from the fire. The stolen supplies had cast a heavy shadow over the group, and the unease among them was palpable. Poirot had remained in his corner, carefully observing his companions, noting every shift in their demeanour, every glance exchanged when they thought no one was looking. Dr. Richter had attempted to maintain control, directing the others to check the remaining supplies and fortify the cabin as best they could. But it was clear to Poirot that the scientist's authority was beginning to falter. The weight of the storm, the theft, and the mounting tension in the room was beginning to crack the facade of calm that Richter had so carefully constructed. Poirot, ever patient, waited. He knew that the key to this mystery lay in the characters around him. Each one of them had a role to play, and each one held a piece of the puzzle. He had already begun to form impressions, but tonight he would take a more direct approach. It was time to gather the suspects. As the hour grew later, Poirot stood and moved to the centre of the room, his sharp eyes glinting in the firelight. His presence immediately commanded attention, and the group fell silent, their eyes turning to him. Without a word, he motioned for them to gather around. "We must not waste time," Poirot began, his voice low but steady. "The theft is only the beginning. There is more at stake here than stolen supplies. Something darker is unfolding, and I intend to discover what." Dr. Richter stood first, as though automatically assuming the role of leader. "What do you mean, Poirot?" "We are trapped here, isolated by the storm. We have no choice but to wait until it passes." Poirot's eyes flicked to him, noting the slight tremor in Richter's hand as he ran it through his hair. The scientist's nerves were starting to show, and Poirot was quick to register the signs. "I do not think you understand," Poirot replied, his tone measured. "The storm is but a symptom of a greater problem. We are not simply stranded here by weather. We are trapped by something far more dangerous." The room fell silent, the weight of Poirot's words sinking in. Viktor Ivanov was the first to speak, his thick Russian accent cutting through the stillness. "What are you implying, Poirot?" "That someone among us is responsible for the theft." Ivanov's eyes were hard, his expression unreadable. Poirot gave a small, deliberate nod. "Indeed, I suspect that one of you has been playing a dangerous game, perhaps more than one. The storm is merely a distraction, a convenient cover for what is truly afoot." Anne Sims, who had been watching silently until now, spoke up. "But why? Why would any of us risk everything to steal supplies? We came here for the same purpose, to work, to study." Poirot's gaze met hers. and for a moment the intensity of his look seemed to chill her. Yes, Mademoiselle Sims, but some have more to gain than others from the success of this expedition, and some have more to lose. The room fell into an uneasy silence once again. Poirot could see the tension mounting, the doubt and suspicion creeping into their eyes. He had expected as much. It was time to begin the process of drawing out the truths hidden behind their facades. "I will start with each of you," Poirot continued, his voice calm but firm. "I shall ask questions and you will answer honestly. Perhaps then the truth will become clearer." He turned to Dr. Richter first. "You, Monsieur Richter, you are the leader of this expedition, yes? You have led these men and women into this frozen wilderness, and yet you seem troubled. Why is that?" Richter stiffened, but the briefest flicker of unease crossed his features. I'm not troubled, Poirot. I am simply focused on the task at hand. This storm has thrown us off course, but we will adapt." Poirot's eyes narrowed, and he didn't miss the slight shift in Richter's posture, the way his hands clenched at his sides. "Adapt," Poirot repeated. "Yes, but it is not the storm that troubles you, is it? It is the fact that something has gone wrong. You did not expect your expedition to take such a turn." Richter opened his mouth to retort, but Poirot's gaze silenced him. He turned his attention to Ivanov. "And you, Monsieur Ivanov, a man of few words, but I can see that your mind is active, calculating. What do you think of these events?" Ivanov shrugged, a small, dismissive movement. "I think the storm is the real enemy here. We should focus on survival." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Ah, but survival is more than just a matter of weather, is it not, Monsieur Ivanov? You are a geologist. You understand how much can be hidden beneath the surface. Perhaps you understand better than most that the things we cannot see are the most dangerous." Ivanov's eyes hardened, but he said nothing more. Poirot turned to Anne Sims last. "And you, Mademoiselle Sims, what do you make of these events?" She hesitated, her eyes flickering between the others. I don't know. This feels wrong. All of it. But I don't know who would do such a thing." Poirot nodded, his expression inscrutable. "Ah, but you sense it, do you not? Something is off. Something is hidden. The question is, who is hiding it?" He stepped back, his gaze sweeping over the gay group. The air in the cabin was thick with tension, and the storm outside continued its relentless assault. Poirot had planted the seed of doubt, but now it was time for the next step. "I will leave you to your thoughts," he said softly, his eyes lingering on each person in turn. "But remember, the truth is like a shadow. It can be avoided, but it cannot be escaped." As Poirot turned and retreated to his corner, the room seemed to grow colder. The suspects were now fully aware that their every word and action was being scrutinized. The game had truly begun. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. The silence that followed Poirot's departure from the group felt suffocating, like the calm before a storm. Each person sat in their respective place, still and tense, with their eyes occasionally darting toward one another, as if waiting for some signal to break the damning quiet. Outside, the storm raged, battering the cabin with the fury of a beast left unchecked. But inside, the storm was one of a different kind, a storm of suspicion and rising dread. Poirot, ever the calm centre, had left them in a whirlpool of uncertainty. His piercing questions had unsettled each one, exposing their cracks without them even realizing it. They had all watched him, that uncanny figure in the corner, studying them as though they were pieces on a chessboard, each move calculated, each expression noted. They did not know what to make of his composure, but it was undeniable. He was not one to be taken lightly. It was in the middle of this growing tension that Poirot made his entrance once more. He stepped into the room, his presence cutting through the stillness like a sharp, sudden breath. The firelight flickered off his well-groomed figure, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with the shifting flames. He moved toward the center of the room, slow and deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world, unlike the rest of them, who were beginning to feel as though their time was rapidly running out. He did not speak immediately. Instead, Poirot let the silence linger, his eyes sweeping across the group, taking in every detail with meticulous care. He could see it, the subtle shifts in posture, the way their eyes flickered away when his gaze met theirs, the way they clenched their hands, and the tension in their necks as they tried to hold themselves together under his penetrating stare. Finally he spoke, his voice as smooth and calculated as ever. "We are all, it seems, running from the same storm. But I wonder—" He paused, letting the words hang in the air, making sure they had his full attention. "Is it the storm that troubles you? Or is it the fear of what the storm has uncovered?" The question was met with silence, the tension thickening in the room. Dr. Richter, who had been absent-mindedly stirring a cup of tea, set it down with a sharp clink. His eyes darted nervously toward Poirot. "We've already discussed this, Poirot. We are trapped by the storm. We can do nothing but wait." Poirot's gaze never wavered from Dr. Richter. "Ah, Monsieur Richter, always so practical. But you see, I do not believe you are waiting for the storm to pass. No, you are waiting for something else. A resolution, perhaps, to a matter that has been weighing on you for quite some time." Poirot's eyes flicked briefly to the others, taking in their reactions before turning back to the scientist. "Am I wrong?" Richter's face tightened, and for a moment Poirot saw the man's usual control slip. The scientist's carefully maintained composure was beginning to crumble, his sharp features showing signs of strain. He cleared his throat and shifted uncomfortably, but Poirot's gaze remained unyielding. "Please, Poirot," Richter muttered, trying to regain his footing. "We have been through enough already. We must focus on surviving this storm." Poirot ignored the plea, his sharp eyes moving to Ivanov, whose silence had become particularly noticeable in the last few minutes. The Russian geologist sat rigidly, arms crossed, as though trying to shut out the world. Poirot studied him with quiet intensity. "You, Monsieur Ivanov," Poirot continued, his voice cutting through the tension, "are more reticent than the others. Why is that, I wonder? Does the storm hold no interest for you? Or perhaps it is the storm of our little mystery that is the true source of your discomfort?" Ivanov met Poirot's gaze, his steely eyes narrowing. "I prefer to keep my thoughts to myself, Poirot. Some of us have learned not to speak when there is nothing of value to say." Poirot allowed himself a small smile, though there was no warmth in it. "Indeed, Monsieur Ivanov, but sometimes silence speaks louder than words." Anne Sims, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke, her voice trembling just slightly. "We're all in this together, Poirot. Why are you putting us on edge? Why can't we just focus on getting through this?" Poirot's eyes softened for just a moment, his gaze flickering toward her. He could see the fear in her eyes, the nervousness that seemed to ripple beneath the surface. She was trying to hold it together, but Poirot could see that it was a fragile facade. "I'm not putting anyone on edge, Mademoiselle Sims," he said gently. "I am simply making an observation. You see, the truth is often revealed in the quiet moments, in the pauses between words. And in this room there are many quiet moments, are there not?" He turned to face the group once more, his eyes scanning them with an almost unnerving calm. "We have much to learn about one another, and I believe that the truth will come, whether we are ready for it or not." The room fell silent again, and Poirot allowed the weight of his words to settle in. The storm outside continued its assault on the cabin, but it was clear now that the true storm was brewing within. The pieces were in motion, and though the mystery had only just begun to unfold, Poirot knew that the answers were already beginning to reveal themselves, one clue, one glance, one subtle movement at a time. And as the storm raged on, Poirot felt the familiar stirrings of excitement within. The game was afoot, and it would be a game that would test them all. Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the cabin as the group settled into an uneasy quiet. Poirot's presence still lingered in the room like a sharp scent that refused to dissipate, and the silence that had descended seemed to amplify every creak of the wooden floorboards and gust of wind outside. The storm had not abated, nor had the tension within the group. Poirot stood, his hands neatly folded before him, as though preparing for an intricate puzzle to unfold. The time for idle observations had passed. It was time to begin the methodical dissection of the mystery, starting with each individual in the room. He looked at the group, his gaze sweeping over them with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "I shall speak to each of you in turn," he said, his voice calm and unhurried. "We have much to uncover, and I am confident that through our conversation we shall find that which is hidden." The group exchanged wary glances, but no one spoke. Poirot's eyes flicked to Dr. Richter, who was seated near the fire. The scientist was tapping his fingers nervously against the arm of his chair, an unmistakable sign of tension. The cracks in his carefully maintained composure were becoming more apparent. "Let us begin with you, Monsieur Richter," Poirot said, his tone respectful but unwavering. "You are the leader of this expedition. Tell me, what brought you to the Arctic? What is it that you hope to achieve with this journey?" Dr. Richter looked taken aback by the directness of the question. For a moment he hesitated, his eyes narrowing as if considering how best to respond. He began, clearing his throat. "I came for the advancement of science, of course, to study the ice formations, to gain a better understanding of the ancient layers of the earth. There is much to be discovered here." Poirot nodded, taking in Richter's words with a measured expression. "Yes, of course, but I wonder, Monsieur Richter, is that all? Surely such an endeavour cannot be the sole motivation for such a dangerous and remote journey. There must be something more, something personal." Dr. Richter stiffened, his jaw clenching slightly. "I assure you, Poirot, there is nothing more. This is strictly a scientific mission, nothing else." Poirot studied him for a moment longer, his eyes narrowing. "I see. Very well." He turned his gaze toward the others, noting the subtle shift in Dr. Richter's posture. "I will speak with the others now." Next, Poirot's gaze landed on Victor Ivanov, who was still sitting with his arms crossed, his face as impassive as ever. Poirot moved toward him with deliberate steps, each one measured and precise. "Monsieur Ivanov," Poirot said, his voice soft but firm, "you are a geologist, yes?" "A man of the earth. Tell me, how do you find the conditions here in the frozen wilderness?" Ivanov's eyes flicked to Poirot briefly before returning to the fire. "The conditions are harsh," he replied gruffly, his accent thick. "But that is to be expected. We knew what we were getting into when we came. The cold does not bother me." Poirot's eyes twinkled slightly as though he had caught something beneath Ivanov's words. Ah, but it is not the cold that concerns me, Monsieur Ivanov. It is dangerous. It is always the danger that hides beneath the surface. What is it that you fear, if not the cold? Ivanov stiffened, his expression hardening. I do not fear, he snapped. I am here to do my work, nothing more. Poirot studied him for a moment longer, then nodded as if satisfied by the response, or perhaps by the lack of it. He turned his attention to Anne Sims, who had been sitting quietly, her gaze fixed on the floor, as though deep in thought. Mademoiselle Sims, Poirot began, his tone gentler this time. You seem troubled. Is there something you would like to share with me? Anne looked up, startled by the directness of his question. She swallowed, her throat tight. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice wavering slightly. Poirot leaned forward, his gaze penetrating. You are anxious, mademoiselle, I can see it. The others may not notice, but I do. Why is that? What is it that you are not saying? She hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting in her lap. It's just... everything feels wrong. The storm, the theft, it's too much. I'm not used to this. I don't know who to trust anymore. Poirot's eyes softened just a fraction, though his voice remained steady. Trust is a fragile thing, mademoiselle. It is easily broken, but I assure you, you are not alone in your suspicions. We will find the answers together. He paused for a moment, giving Anne a chance to gather herself. Then, turning his attention back to the group, he surveyed them all once more. I have asked my questions, Poirot said finally, standing tall. Now we wait. We watch. And we listen. The truth is always there, beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered, but it will only reveal itself to those who are willing to see. The room fell silent again, the tension thick and palpable. Poirot's words hung in the air like a silent promise, a reminder that the game was just beginning. Each person in the room had been marked by his sharp gaze, each had revealed something in their answers, or in their hesitation. Poirot had already begun to form his theory, and though it was still shrouded in mystery, he could feel the threads beginning to weave together. But even Poirot knew this was only the beginning. The storm outside might keep them trapped, but it would also keep their secrets hidden, at least for a while longer. Chapter 6. The first false lead. The wind howled like a wounded animal, pressing itself against the walls of the cabin, as though trying to get in. The storm outside showed no sign of abating, and as the hours dragged on, the atmosphere inside grew increasingly stifling. Poirot could sense the strain, the uncertainty, the slow unravelling of the group's resolve. He knew it wouldn't be long before the smallest disturbance would cause everything to break wide open. He paced the length of the room, his mind still turning over the clues he had gathered. He had spoken with each of them, heard their answers, some careful, others more revealing than they knew. There was something about the way they each tried so desperately to hide their nervousness, their unease, that intrigued Poirot. He had learned something in each interview, but the threads weren't yet fully woven together. He had a theory forming in the back of his mind, but he knew better than to rush. It was time to introduce a little chaos, a distraction, to see how each of them reacted. And so he began to set his plan into motion. As the evening wore on, Poirot leaned forward, his hands steepled before him, and spoke softly. There is something I have noticed, something curious. One of you, I believe, is hiding something. The room immediately tensed, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the walls as every eye turned to him. Even those who had tried to remain composed now shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their faces betraying their unease. "Do not misunderstand me," Poirot continued, his voice measured. "I do not know what it is you are hiding, but I am certain of one thing. There is more to this than a mere theft. Someone here has something to gain from the storm, from our isolation, and it is this secret that I intend to uncover." The group exchanged glances, their suspicion turning toward one another. Dr. Richter, who had been sitting closest to the fire, fidgeted with the rim of his mug, his eyes narrowing. "Poirot, this is absurd. We are all in the same situation. No one here has anything to gain from this. We're stuck here until the storm passes." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but Monsieur Richter, you have just made my point. Everyone here has something to gain, whether they realize it or not." Anne Sims, who had remained silent for most of the evening, spoke up. Her voice trembled slightly, betraying the fear she was trying so hard to conceal. "What are you suggesting, Poirot? That one of us caused the storm, or that someone here is behind the theft?" Poirot's gaze shifted toward her, his eyes cold but thoughtful. "I am not suggesting anything just yet, Mademoiselle Sims. I am simply observing. But yes, I suspect that one of you may have created the perfect opportunity for this theft. The storm has trapped us here, and with it the perfect chance for someone to make a move without being seen." The tension in the room was palpable. Viktor Ivanov was the next to speak, his tone dismissive but guarded. "This is nonsense, Poirot. If we were all trapped here, how could anyone leave the cabin to steal anything without being noticed? We would have seen them." Poirot paused, letting the silence settle before replying. "Ah, but you are wrong, Monsieur Ivanov. That is exactly what makes this theft so clever. The storm, the howling wind, the isolation. It gives the thief the perfect cover. No one would think to look for them outside, and I suspect, for reasons unknown to us all, that the theft is just the beginning. I believe someone in this room has orchestrated it." Dr. Richter's face grew pale. "This is madness. I am the leader of this expedition. Why would I steal from it? What would I gain?" Poirot smiled, ever so slightly. "Perhaps not you, Monsieur Richter, but someone here has. And you, like the rest, are so eager to prove your innocence that you fail to see the truth. The real question is not who did it, but why. What is their end game?" A long silence followed, broken only by the relentless gusts of wind outside. No one spoke for a long while, each of them turning over the idea in their minds, trying to make sense of Poirot's words. Poirot, ever the strategist, let the tension grow. He had given them a challenge, a false lead, if you will. His goal was simple, to observe how they responded, to see who cracked under the pressure. He could feel their anxiety building, the subtle shifts in the room, the way they were beginning to second-guess themselves. And then, just as planned, the distraction arrived. A loud, resounding crash echoed through the cabin, so sudden and so jarring that everyone jumped, their eyes wide with alarm. The fire crackled loudly, the only sound for a brief moment, before the group sprang to their feet, their gazes darting toward the source of the noise. The back door to the cabin had slammed open. Poirot, who had been watching the room with quiet intent, turned slowly toward the door, his expression unreadable. The others stood frozen, unsure of what to do, their breath held in anticipation. A figure emerged from the howling storm outside, dripping wet, shivering, and half collapsed from the force of the wind. It was Dr. Richter. He had disappeared outside during the storm without anyone noticing, and now, as he staggered back into the cabin, soaked to the bone and wild-eyed, his arrival seemed to confirm Poirot's suspicions. But it was too soon. This was only the beginning. Poirot's eyes narrowed, and the game took a new, dangerous turn. the first false lead had already been set into motion. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. The door slammed shut behind Dr. Richter with a force that seemed to reverberate through the cabin, silencing the room. The group stood frozen, eyes wide, staring at the disheveled figure who had just re-entered, soaked to the skin from the howling storm outside. Dr. Richter, his face pale and wide-eyed, was gasping for breath as though he had been running for his life. The storm outside had certainly taken its toll on him, but it was not just the elements that seemed to have rattled him. No, it was something else, something that flickered in his eyes, something that sent a chill through the others. For a long moment, no one spoke. The crackling fire was the only sound that filled the oppressive silence. Poirot was the first to break the stillness, his voice smooth and calm as ever, betraying no hint of surprise. "Monsieur Richter," he said, his gaze never leaving the man as he approached. "You seem troubled. What brings you back to such a state?" Dr. Richter swallowed hard, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he wiped his brow with the back of his hand. His voice, when it finally came, was hoarse, and he seemed almost unable to meet Poirot's gaze. I went outside to check the conditions. The wind is so fierce, and I thought I could perhaps find something useful. But I didn't expect the storm, the force of it." Poirot nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And yet you managed to return so quickly. A most curious thing. Were you looking for something specific, perhaps? Or was this a simple errand?" Richter's gaze flickered, but he quickly masked it with a forced expression of determination. "I was, looking for supplies. I thought there might be something outside that we missed. Something—" He stopped himself, shaking his head as if trying to dismiss the thought. Poirot's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, studying the man's every movement. "Ah, supplies," he repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, perhaps you did go looking for supplies, though I wonder, Monsieur Richter, why did you feel the need to go outside in such weather, with no one else noticing your absence?" The group shifted uncomfortably at Poirot's words, their eyes darting from Richter to each other. No one had noticed the scientist leaving the cabin, and now his sudden return, his disheveled state, his unexplained actions, seemed to stir suspicion. Richter was quick to respond, his voice a little too sharp. "I did not think it necessary to announce every little movement. Surely you cannot believe that I would—" "I believe nothing, Monsieur Richter," Poirot interrupted, his voice cool and steady. "I only observe. But I do not think it is a simple matter of supplies. You were outside for a reason." Dr. Richter opened his mouth to protest again, but Poirot raised a hand, silencing him. The room was thick with tension, and Poirot could see that the scientist was starting to break. Cracks were beginning to show in his carefully constructed facade. "Monsieur Richter, tell me," Poirot continued, his voice steady and almost conversational, "what is it you fear most in this situation? The storm, the cold, or perhaps the fact that you are not as in control as you would like to believe?" Richter took a step back, his eyes widening at the unexpected turn in the conversation. He looked like a man who had just been struck by a sudden realization, and for a moment his composure faltered, but only for a moment. He quickly recovered, his shoulders stiffening. "I fear nothing," he snapped, his voice sharp and defensive. "I have been in more dangerous situations than this. The storm does not intimidate me." Poirot tilted his head slightly, studying him with a penetrating gaze. "No, I imagine the storm does not trouble you. But the storm of this investigation, this is different, isn't it? There is something here that threatens you in a way that the storm cannot." The silence that followed was thick with meaning. Dr. Richter's eyes darted around the room, avoiding the gaze of the others. It was clear to Poirot that the man was struggling to maintain control, and this, he knew, was the key. In moments of weakness, the truth always found its way to the surface. Anne Sims, who had been watching quietly from the corner, finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Are you suggesting that Dr. Richter has something to do with the theft? That he—" Poirot held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Not just the theft, Mademoiselle Sims. There is more. The theft, the storm, the missing supplies, all of it is connected, but to see the connections we must understand the minds of those involved." He turned back to Richter, his eyes never leaving the scientist's face. "Monsieur Richter, tell me, what are you afraid of? What are you hiding?" Richter took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort. His hands clenched at his sides, and for a brief moment Poirot thought he might break. But the scientist merely stood there, trembling, staring at Poirot as though caught in the web of his own thoughts. "Monsieur Poirot," Richter finally said, his voice low, "there is something you do not know, something that has nothing to do with the theft, but everything to do with why we are all here." Poirot's gaze sharpened, and his heart raced with anticipation. He had pushed him too far. He had broken through the walls, and now the secret Richter had been hiding, whatever it was finally beginning to emerge. "What is it, Monsieur Richter?" Poirot pressed gently. "Tell me what you fear most." The scientist hesitated for a long moment, his lips pressed into a thin line before finally speaking the words that would change everything. "There is no way out. We're all trapped here, and someone among us has already planned to kill again." The room fell into an eerie silence. The fire crackled, the storm raged on outside, and the game, it seemed, had taken a darker turn. Chapter 8. A secondary mystery. The room fell deathly quiet after Dr. Richter's words, the weight of his confession pressing down on the group like a suffocating blanket. Poirot's eyes, sharp and unwavering, never left the scientist. The tension in the room was so thick it seemed to hang in the air like a fog, and even the fire's warmth felt suddenly distant. Dr. Richter's statement had cracked open a door that had been carefully sealed for a reason. Someone among them had planned to kill again. The implications of that were staggering: the theft, the storm, and now the threat of murder. It was clear that their situation was far more dire than anyone had imagined. "Explain yourself, Monsieur Richter." Poirot's voice cut through the silence, calm but firm. "What do you mean by someone has planned to kill again?" Richter stood frozen, his eyes darting from one face to another. The storm's howling winds seemed to echo in the distance, as though the cabin itself was holding its breath in anticipation. Finally, Richter's voice trembled as he spoke. "It's not what you think," he said, his words strained. Then tell us, Doctor." "Richter," Poirot pressed, "tell us what you know." The scientist swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he clutched the edge of his chair. He seemed to be struggling with an internal battle, his mind torn between revealing the truth and hiding behind the facade he had so carefully built. Finally, after a long, tense silence, he spoke again, his voice low and reluctant. "I've been receiving threats before the expedition began, anonymous letters, cryptic, threatening. They warned me that something would go wrong on this journey. They warned me that someone among us would be killed." Poirot's eyes sharpened. He had not expected this, but the revelation made perfect sense in light of the growing tension. The mystery was expanding, unfolding like a series of interconnected webs. But there was still so much they didn't know. "Who sent these letters, Monsieur Richter?" Poirot asked, his voice tight with curiosity. I don't know, Richter admitted, his voice breaking. They were always unsigned, always addressed to me in the most subtle way. I thought it was just a prank at first, but now I'm not so sure. Poirot turned his gaze to the others, each one of them now caught in the web of suspicion. If there were threats involved, if someone had been planning this before the expedition even began, it meant that the killer could have been preparing for this moment long before they had set foot in the cabin. The storm, Poirot murmured thoughtfully. The storm, the theft, and now these threats. Everything is connected, but how? The group exchanged uneasy glances, each one processing the implications in their own way. Poirot could see it now. Each of them was holding something back, afraid of what might be exposed if they spoke too freely. They were all part of this intricate puzzle, but they were also each a piece of the mystery. And it was not just the theft that was at stake anymore. Poirot's mind worked quickly, piecing together the threads of the mystery. This was no longer just about the stolen supplies. Someone had anticipated this. Someone had planned it. The question was why? What was the motive behind these threats, behind this sinister preparation? A sudden, jarring noise interrupted Poirot's thoughts, a loud thud followed by a series of rapid footsteps. The group froze, and Poirot's sharp eyes darted toward the door. Someone had left the room in haste, the heavy door creaking as it swung open. Poirot moved swiftly toward the door, his movements deliberate but silent. The others were too stunned to react immediately, their eyes wide with confusion and fear. Poirot stepped outside, the icy wind biting at his face as he scanned the immediate surroundings. There, near the far corner of the cabin, stood Anne Sims. Her back was turned to him, and she was clutching something tightly in her hands. "Ah, Mademoiselle Sims," Poirot's voice rang out, startling her. She jumped, spinning around with a look of shock on her face. I didn't mean to," she stammered, but Poirot was already closing the distance between them. He reached her in a few swift steps, his gaze flicking down to the object she was holding. It was a small bundle of letters, their edges frayed from being hastily opened and read. "What is this, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked, his voice low but penetrating. "Why are you holding these?" Anne's face flushed with embarrassment and fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out at first. Finally, she spoke, her voice shaky. I found them, the letters. I didn't want to say anything, but when Dr. Richter mentioned the threats, Poirot interrupted her, his eyes narrowing. "You knew about the letters? You knew before any of this happened?" Anne nodded, her face pale. "I thought it was a joke. I thought it was just some madman trying to frighten him. But when the storm hit and the theft happened, I couldn't keep quiet anymore. I knew something was wrong." Poirot took a slow breath, his mind working through the new piece of the puzzle. The letters were real, and Anne had known about them. But why hadn't she spoken up before? What was she hiding? Poirot turned back toward the others in the cabin, his eyes scanning their faces once more. There was still so much to uncover, but one thing was certain. This mystery was about to take a much darker turn, and with that, the secondary mystery had begun to unfold. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The revelation of the letters unsettled the group, and the unease was palpable. Anne Sims, clutching the bundle of letters to her chest, stood frozen, her face pale, as if awaiting judgment. Poirot, ever the calm observer, noted her nervousness, striking after such an unexpected revelation. Anne's gaze flickered from Poirot to the others, her eyes wide with apprehension. "I didn't know what to think," she stammered. "The letters were disturbing, but I thought they were for Dr. Richter alone. I didn't think we'd be involved. Poirot stepped closer, observing her closely. And yet, mademoiselle, you kept these letters hidden. Why? Anne swallowed hard. I thought it wasn't my business, but when Dr. Richter spoke of the threats, I realized he's not the only one targeted. I should have told you earlier, but you were afraid, Poirot interrupted gently but firmly. Afraid of what you might uncover, afraid of revealing too much. These letters are part of something larger. They connect to the storm, the theft, and someone here is hiding something far darker. Anne nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping as the weight of the truth settled on her. She handed the bundle to Poirot, who scanned the contents. The letters were cryptic, filled with vague threats, but they all referenced an unknown individual, someone orchestrating events from the shadows. Poirot's mind raced. The letters were messages not from a random source, but from someone who knew the group intimately. But who and why? The pieces were starting to form, though the full picture remained elusive. As Poirot read the last letter, he looked up. The tension in the room grew heavier. These letters, he said, his voice cutting through the silence, were not written by just anyone. They were written by someone who knows all of you. Someone who has been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. The group exchanged wary glances, the weight of realization settling in. If the letters were tied to the storm and the theft, the person behind them was far more involved than anyone had suspected. Whoever is behind these letters, Poirot continued, is not just trying to frighten us. They are orchestrating events, pushing us toward an outcome, and they are doing it from within this cabin. Dr. Richter, who had been silent, spoke with strain in his voice. What are you suggesting, Poirot, that one of us is behind this? Poirot's gaze was fixed on the scientist. I am suggesting that one of you knows more than you're letting on. One of you is hiding something, a connection to these letters, the theft and the storm. The room fell silent. Poirot turned back to Anne. Mademoiselle Sims, you've hidden these letters, but I believe there's more to your story. What do you know? Anne hesitated, her eyes darting nervously. She stopped herself, biting her lip, holding something back. Poirot could see it in her posture. Tell me, Poirot urged gently. We're all in this together. Who sent these letters? Anne opened her mouth, but no words came. She handed the letters back, regret in her eyes. Poirot took the letters once more. As he read through them, a thought struck him. The handwriting was deliberate, familiar. Suddenly, Poirot knew who was behind the letters. The moment for the reveal would come soon enough. As the storm raged on, the web of deception tightened. Poirot was ready. Chapter 10. Poirot's secret clue. The cabin was still, suffocating, as if holding its breath after Poirot's latest observations. The fire crackled in the corner, offering little warmth against the chill in the room. Anne Sims, clutching the letters to her chest, stood frozen, pale, as though awaiting judgment. Poirot, ever composed, noted her nervousness, an unexpected revelation that could either clarify everything or deepen the mystery. Anne's gaze flickered nervously from Poirot to the others. I didn't know what to think, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The letters were disturbing, but I thought they were meant for Dr. Richter alone. I didn't think we'd be involved. Poirot observed her carefully, stepping closer. And yet, mademoiselle, you kept these letters hidden. Why? Anne swallowed, her breath shaky. I thought it wasn't my business, but when Dr. Richter spoke of threats, I realized he's not the only one being targeted. I should have told you sooner, but you were afraid, Poirot interrupted gently but firmly. afraid of what you might uncover, afraid of what you might reveal. And now we know these letters are part of something larger. They connect to the theft, to the storm, and to someone here hiding something darker. Anne nodded slowly, shoulders slumping under the weight of the truth. She handed the bundle of letters to Poirot, who began scanning them. The letters were cryptic, filled with vague threats and ominous warnings. But Poirot saw more than just threats. There was a constant reference to an unknown individual, someone who seemed to be orchestrating events from the shadows. Poirot's mind raced. These letters weren't random. They were from someone who knew the group intimately. But who and why? The possibilities were forming, but the full picture was elusive. Poirot stopped reading, looked up at the group. His expression was unreadable. "These letters," he said slowly, "were not written by just anyone. They were written by someone who knows all of you, someone who has been watching, waiting for the right moment." The room shifted, the implications sinking in. If the letters were connected to the theft and storm, the person behind them was far more involved than anyone had realized. "Whoever is behind these letters," Poirot continued, "isn't just trying to frighten us. They're orchestrating events, pushing us toward an outcome. And they're doing it from within this cabin." Dr. Richter, who had been silent, finally spoke. "What are you suggesting, Poirot? That one of us is behind this?" Poirot's eyes never left Richter's. "I'm suggesting that one of you knows more than you're letting on. One of you is hiding something, a connection to these letters, the theft, and perhaps even the storm." The group fell silent, the weight of Poirot's words hanging heavily in the air. Poirot turned back to Anne. "Mademoiselle Sims, you've kept these letters hidden, but I believe there's more to your story than you're telling. What do you know about these letters? Why do you have them?" Anne hesitated, eyes darting nervously. She stopped herself, biting her lip. Poirot could see she was holding something back. "Tell me," Poirot urged gently. "We're all in this together. Who sent these letters?" Anne opened her mouth, but no words came. Instead, she handed the letters back, her face filled with regret. Poirot took the letters again, his mind focused. As he turned the pages, a subtle detail struck him. The handwriting wasn't random. It was deliberate, methodical, and familiar. Poirot's eyes narrowed. He knew who was behind the letters, but revealing that information would require the perfect moment, the right confrontation. As the storm raged outside, the web of deception tightened. Poirot was ready. The truth would soon be revealed. Chapter 11. Tensions Rise. The tension in the room grew thicker as Poirot's words lingered in the air, echoing like a drumbeat. Every person in the cabin was on edge, their gazes shifting nervously from one to another. The weight of Poirot's discovery had shaken them all to the core. They could feel it now. Something far more sinister was at play, and they were all caught in the web. Poirot's steady gaze swept over the group, assessing each of them as though peeling back their layers. His earlier discovery had left everyone with more questions than answers, and it was clear that the pressure was beginning to take its toll. Dr. Richter was the first to react, his hands trembling slightly as he clutched his mug. "This is madness, Poirot. You're implying that one of us is behind this entire situation, behind the storm, the theft, and even the threats. This is absurd." Poirot's eyes did not waver from Richter's face. "No, Monsieur Richter, I am not implying anything. I am simply stating facts. These letters, the storm and the theft, they are all connected, and they point to someone within this room." Richter opened his mouth to protest, but Poirot's gaze was unyielding, quieting him. Anne Sims, who had been holding herself together with difficulty, suddenly spoke, her voice trembling. "Who would do such a thing? We're all here, in the middle of nowhere, stuck with each other, and now you're telling us one of us is plotting something worse. How can you be so sure, Poirot?" Poirot's eyes softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "Mademoiselle Sims, doubt is a powerful thing. It clouds the mind and distorts what is before us. But if you look carefully, you will see the truth hidden in plain sight." A heavy silence followed his words, and the room seemed to shrink, the tension unbearable. Poirot watched the others carefully. He could see it now, the subtle shifts in their posture, the nervous glances exchanged between them. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing within this room. Viktor Ivanov, who had been silent for some time, finally broke the silence. "This is, unnecessary. We are all trapped here. We cannot leave until the storm passes. No one can do anything." His voice was thick with suspicion, but also a hint of desperation. "There's nothing to gain from this, nothing." Poirot turned to him slowly, his expression inscrutable. "Ah, but there is, Monsieur Ivanov. There is always something to gain. The question is, who benefits from this chaos? Who stands to gain the most?" Ivanov bristled at the question, but he didn't reply. Instead, he glared at Poirot, his suspicion apparent, though masked with a veil of uncertainty. The door creaked open slightly, and Anne Sims stepped toward it, as though she was trying to retreat into the other room. But Poirot's voice stopped her. "Do not run away, mademoiselle," he said, softly but firmly. "The truth will find us all in the end." Anne froze in place, her back to the door. Poirot's words hung in the air like a warning, and she slowly turned back to face him, her face pale with fear. "Monsieur Poirot," she whispered, almost pleading, "you have no idea how deep this goes. The letters, the threats are only the beginning." The group collectively inhaled, the room tense with her admission. Every person seemed to freeze at her words, as if waiting for the next piece to fall into place. Poirot gave a small nod, a trace of recognition in his eyes. "It seems we have only scratched the surface of a much larger puzzle. But rest assured, mademoiselle, I intend to uncover all of it. The truth cannot remain hidden for long." The storm outside raged louder, as if answering him, but inside the cabin the tension was almost unbearable. They were no longer just participants in an investigation. They were pawns in a game far greater than any of them had imagined. And the game, Poirot knew, was about to take a darker turn. Chapter 12. The Confrontation. The cabin had never felt smaller, the walls inching closer with each passing moment. The storm outside continued to rage, its icy fingers clawing at the wooden structure, but it was the tension inside the cabin that truly pressed down on the group. The weight of Poirot's words, the insinuations, the accusations, hung in the air like a dense fog, choking any attempts at normal conversation. Anne Sims had retreated to the far corner of the room, her arms crossed tightly, her face flushed with anxiety. Dr. Richter sat opposite her, his fingers tapping nervously against the table, his once certain demeanour now marred by an unsettling vulnerability. Even Viktor Ivanov, usually so stoic, shifted in his seat, casting frequent glances toward Poirot as if he were waiting for the detective to strike the final blow. Poirot, however, had become the calm centre of the storm, his steady gaze sweeping over the room, absorbing every subtle detail, the quick glances, the nervous movements, the way each person seemed to avoid meeting his eyes for too long. There was something there, he knew it, something that each of them was desperately trying to hide. The fear was palpable. "Enough of these games," Poirot said suddenly, his voice low but commanding, cutting through the unease like a knife. His eyes locked on to Doctor. Richter. Monsieur Richter, it is time to speak the truth. Richter flinched, as if struck. He opened his mouth to protest, but Poirot silenced him with a raised hand. No more lies, no more distractions. We are not children. We are adults, trapped in this web of suspicion, and I believe the time has come to address it. Anne shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Poirot and Dr. Richter. She had been silent for too long, and now her fears seemed to be bubbling to the surface. "Poirot, what are you implying? That one of us is a murderer?" Her voice cracked with a mixture of disbelief and fear. Poirot's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "Mademoiselle Sims, I am implying that one of you knows far more than you are letting on. The question is not whether someone will be murdered. It is whether it has already happened, and if so, who is responsible." A hush fell over the room as his words sank in. Anne paled, her mouth opening and closing as if she could not find the right words. Dr. Richter's face tightened, his hands now clenched into fists on the table, and Ivanov's jaw set in a firm line, his eyes narrowing as though Poirot had just dropped a bombshell on them. "We are all hiding something," Poirot continued, his voice unwavering. "But one of you is hiding more than the rest. One of you is responsible for the chaos that has unfolded here, the theft, the threats, the storm, and it is only a matter of time before the truth comes out." Ivanov stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is insane. We are stuck here because of the storm. There is no murder. There is no grand conspiracy." Poirot did not flinch at the outburst. His eyes remained calm and focused on Ivanov. "Ah, Monsieur Ivanov, you are quick to dismiss the possibility of murder, but I believe you are only too eager to distract us from what is really happening here. Perhaps you, too, have something to hide." Ivanov glared at Poirot, but did not respond. The air in the cabin grew thick with tension, as if the group were teetering on the edge of something much darker, something none of them were prepared to face. Dr. Richter's voice broke the silence, his tone strained and defensive. "You don't understand, Poirot. You don't know what's at stake here." "And what is at stake, Monsieur Richter?" Poirot asked, his voice low and intense. "Your reputation? Your research? Or something far more personal?" The scientist's eyes darted briefly toward the window, as though seeking an escape, before he turned his gaze back to Poirot. The moment lingered, heavy and suffocating, before Richter spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never wanted this," he muttered, the words laced with regret. "But I was forced into it. I had no choice." Poirot leaned forward, his sharp eyes locking onto Richter's. "You had no choice? What do you mean by that?" The room held its breath as Dr. Richter's words hung in the air. Whatever he was about to say, it would reveal the truth, the secret that had been buried beneath the surface all along. But whether or not it would be enough to unravel the mystery and to identify the one behind the storm of deceit remained to be seen. The game had entered its final stage, and the pieces were beginning to fall into place. Chapter 13, A Desperate Attempt to Escape. The silence that followed Dr. Richter's confession was suffocating. Each word he had spoken hung in the air, thick with unspoken implications, but he had said little more than a vague admission of guilt. "I never wanted this," he had muttered, but what this referred to was still unclear. Poirot's eyes never left the scientist's face, but he said nothing, letting the weight of the silence press down on the group. Anne shifted uneasily, her hands clasped tightly together. "What are you talking about, Doctor? Richter?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What did you not want?" Richter's eyes flickered nervously toward the door, and his hand twitched in his lap. The tension in the room escalated, and the storm outside intensified, howling against the cabin as though it, too, was awaiting an answer. Dr. Richter swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing as he hesitated. There was no other way out, you don't understand, he said, his voice cracking under the pressure. I was being forced, threatened. They wanted me to sabotage the mission, to steal the supplies, to make sure you would all be stuck here, isolated. The group leaned forward, eager to understand, but Richter's words became increasingly erratic. You don't understand what they would have done if I hadn't done what they said. I had no choice. Poirot watched him carefully, his eyes narrowing. He had suspected as much. The threat was never just about the storm or the supplies. It was about something deeper, something far more personal. But Richter was still not telling them the full story. Poirot knew that. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, the door to the cabin suddenly burst open with a loud crash. The group froze, their eyes darting to the source of the noise. The howling wind outside was a brutal reminder of how trapped they truly were, but this new interruption carried with it a sense of urgency. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the storm. The tall, imposing shape of Viktor Ivanov was unmistakable, his heavy boots sinking into the cave snow as he stepped into the room. His expression was one of panic, his breathing heavy and his clothes drenched from the storm. "What are you doing, Ivanov?" Dr. Richter asked sharply, his voice rising with tension. Ivanov looked around the room, his eyes wide with fear. "I couldn't take it anymore," he muttered, his voice strained. "I tried to leave. I thought I could find help, get out of here. But the storm, it's too strong. I couldn't." Poirot took a step forward, his gaze steady. "So you tried to escape, Monsieur Ivanov?" "Why? What was so urgent that you risked your life?" Ivanov swallowed, his hands trembling. "I couldn't stay. Not after what I learned. Not after the letters, the threats." Poirot's eyes narrowed in realization. The pieces were finally falling into place. Ivanov had known more than he had let on, just as the others had, but now it was clear the fear was spreading. Someone had made their move, and Ivanov's escape attempt was not just a matter of fleeing from the storm. There was something far more pressing behind it. Before anyone could respond, Ivanov suddenly turned and bolted for the door again. "I can't stay here anymore," he shouted, his voice breaking. The desperation in his tone was unmistakable. Poirot's voice cut through the chaos. "Stop, Monsieur Ivanov," he commanded, his tone firm. But it was too late. Ivanov had already lunged for the door, his hand on the handle, ready to push his way into the storm once more. At that moment, Poirot realized that Ivanov was not just running from the storm, he was running from something or someone that had him cornered. The truth was no longer just buried in words, it was about to reveal itself in action, and someone would have to stop him before it was too late. The room held its breath as Ivanov's final attempt to escape played out. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The cabin was frozen in motion as Ivanov's hand gripped the door handle. For a moment no one moved. The storm outside howled, a constant reminder of the perilous situation they were in. Ivanov's desperate attempt to flee hung in the air like a challenge, his body tense with anticipation. Poirot's voice rang out, breaking the silence. "Stop, Monsieur Ivanov," Poirot said firmly, his tone more commanding than it had been all evening. Ivanov paused, his hand still on the door, his body rigid, as if torn between fleeing and facing the consequences of his actions. His eyes darted nervously around the room, searching for an escape, but the storm outside and Poirot's unwavering gaze made it clear. There was no escaping now. "Why are you running, Ivanov?" Poirot continued, his voice cool, yet laced with an undeniable intensity. "What is so pressing that you would risk your life to escape this cabin? What is it you're trying to hide?" Ivanov didn't answer immediately. His fingers clenched tighter around the door handle, but his eyes betrayed him, glancing first at Poirot, then at the others in the room. His lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came out. The tension was palpable, so thick it seemed to suffocate the air between them. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Ivanov turned, his face pale with fear. He backed away from the door, his body slumping in defeat. I can't stay here any longer, you don't understand? I was only trying to survive," he muttered, his voice strained and hoarse. Poirot stepped forward, his eyes piercing Ivanov's with a clarity that seemed to reach through the layers of deception. "Survive?" Poirot asked, his tone growing even colder. "Survive from whom? From what?" Ivanov looked down, unable to meet Poirot's gaze. His lips quivered as he struggled to speak, the weight of his own fears and guilt pressing down on him. "I didn't know who I could trust, not anymore. After everything that's happened, I couldn't stay. I didn't know if it was you or one of them." Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mind piecing the fragmented clues together. "One of them?" he repeated. "You're speaking of someone else, someone outside of this room, someone else involved in this game." Ivanov nodded, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I thought I could escape. But now I know I can't. I was warned. The letters, they were meant to drive us to the edge, to make us doubt each other. And now—" He paused, his face contorting with the weight of his confession. "Now it's too late." Poirot stood still, his mind racing. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for, the moment the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. The letters were more than just threats. They were part of a calculated strategy, designed to manipulate and divide. And the person behind it all wasn't one of them. It was someone else, someone who had orchestrated this entire ordeal from the shadows. "Who was it, Ivanov?" Poirot asked quietly. "Who is behind this? Who is the mastermind pulling the strings?" Ivanov's gaze fell to the floor, his voice barely audible. It's someone you least expect." Poirot's breath caught in his throat, the final piece of the mystery beginning to reveal itself. But before he could ask another question, the door behind them suddenly slammed shut, the sound cutting through the heavy air like a knife. They were not alone. The real game was only beginning. Chapter 15. The Final Gathering. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed through the cabin, the noise rattling the walls like a warning. Poirot froze, his sharp eyes scanning the room, every muscle in his body tensing. The others had all heard it too. Their heads snapped toward the door, and the room went deathly silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire. The storm outside continued its fury, but inside the storm had changed in nature. This was no longer about the weather or the theft. The threat was much more immediate, and the air in the room was thick with tension. Poirot stood still for a moment longer, his mind working as quickly as ever, trying to analyze the situation. Ivanov's admission, though fragmented, had been the final clue, the catalyst to unraveling the mystery. But now, with the door closed and no explanation for the interruption, Poirot sensed that something had shifted. Someone was making their move, and this time they were not hiding in the shadows. "Stay where you are," Poirot commanded softly, his gaze never leaving the door. The others seemed to instinctively obey, their bodies stiff with anticipation, eyes wide. The group was beginning to understand. They were in more danger than they had ever realized. The answers were within their reach, but only if they could survive the next few minutes. Poirot's gaze swept across the room, settling on each of them in turn. Dr. Richter, his face drawn tight with nerves, was standing close to the table, his hands trembling. Anne Sims was clutching her arms to her chest, her breath shallow. Victor Ivanov, who had been desperate to flee moments before, was now frozen in place, his eyes darting nervously from Poirot to the door. "Whoever has closed that door," Poirot said, his voice low but filled with quiet authority, "has made a mistake. The truth cannot be locked away. We will find it. But first, we must confront what is happening here. All of you." The room held its breath as Poirot moved toward the door, his footsteps quiet but purposeful. The group watched him, torn between relief and dread. They had all been waiting for this moment, the moment Poirot would finally uncover the hidden mastermind. But none of them had expected the storm to reach this pitch, nor for Poirot to be the calm center of it all. Poirot reached for the door handle, his fingers brushing it with a quiet certainty. He turned it slowly, then pushed the door open. The howling wind outside seemed to rush in, gusting past him with renewed force. But no one had entered. No one was there. Poirot stepped back, glancing back at the group with a knowing look. "No one," he said simply, his voice calm, yet tinged with an edge of finality. It was a warning. Someone wants us to believe they have control. Anne's voice was a whisper, almost afraid to be heard. "But if no one's out there, what does that mean?" Poirot turned to face them all, his gaze sharper than ever. "It means the game is about to reach its conclusion. And I suspect we are about to face the truth, whether we are ready for it or not." As the fire flickered behind him, Poirot moved to stand at the center of the room, his eyes scanning the group once more. The pieces were in motion, and the truth was about to be revealed. It was only a matter of time before someone cracked, and Poirot was ready to ensure it would be the right person. The final confrontation was near. Chapter 16. The Reveal. The air in the cabin was thick with suspense. The door that had slammed shut behind them was now open, revealing only the furious storm outside, its winds howling like an animal hunting its prey. Inside, however, the tension was far more oppressive, wrapping the group in a choking grip. The calm, measured voice of Poirot had become the anchor in the midst of their rising panic. But even Poirot's calm demeanor seemed to shift slightly, his patience wearing thin as the moments dragged on. They were all in this together, yet they were isolated. Each of them had a secret, something they were hiding. Even Poirot had not fully revealed his hand, but now the game had reached its peak. It was time for the final reveal. Poirot stood still, his eyes scanning the group one last time. "We have been playing a game of cat and mouse for too long, my friends," he said, his voice unwavering. "But no more. The time for hiding is over." The group, already on edge, felt the weight of his words settle in. Anne Sims, standing to the side, looked like she was about to say something, but stopped herself, her lips trembling. Dr. Richter remained unusually silent, his posture stiff, his face pale. Victor Ivanov's eyes shifted nervously, darting between Poirot and the others. The uncertainty that had plagued them all was now pushing them to the edge. Poirot continued, "Every one of you has been playing a role in this little game, but I now understand the part you each play. The theft, the storm, the letters. It all makes sense now." The group held their collective breath, waiting for Poirot to continue. He took a step toward the center of the room, his eyes focused on each of them in turn. "Monsieur Richter," Poirot began, his voice calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "You've been hiding something from us? The letters, the threats." "You knew far more than you let on. And you thought you could control this situation, didn't you? Richter's eyes widened slightly, but he said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. Poirot turned to Ivanov next. And you, Monsieur Ivanov, were the first to try to escape. You thought running would save you, but in reality, it only exposed you further. You knew something. You knew what had happened before anyone else did. Ivanov shifted uncomfortably, his face paling under Poirot's gaze, but still he said nothing. The others watched in silence, the truth slowly sinking in. Poirot's gaze then shifted to Anne. "Mademoiselle Sims," he said softly, "you were the one who found the letters, yet you hid them. Why? Why keep them from us if you truly cared for Dr. Richter's well-being?" Anne's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes met Poirot's, wide with fear, and she opened her mouth to speak, but the words seemed to fail her. Poirot could see the conflict in her. She had been caught in the middle, unsure of how to play her part in this game. Poirot continued, his tone growing firmer. "The truth is simple, my friends. The person behind this, behind the letters, the threats, the manipulation, is none of you. It was never any of you." A silence fell over the group as Poirot's words hung in the air, but there was no immediate gasp of realization. There was no sudden shock. Instead, Poirot's eyes hardened. The mastermind was never one of you. The true orchestrator of this entire plot was someone who has been right under our noses the entire time. The room held its breath. And with those final words, the game was about to take its final turn. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The truth, finally on the verge of revelation, had shifted the balance of power in the room. Each person present stood frozen, their minds struggling to process Poirot's shocking claim. For a moment, the fire crackled in the silence, offering no comfort, only an eerie reminder of how trapped they all were. Poirot's eyes flickered across the room, his steady gaze scrutinizing the faces of those around him. The tension in the cabin had reached its zenith. It was not just the storm outside that had them cornered. It was the knowledge that they were on the brink of uncovering something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The truth, as Poirot had stated, was simple. The mastermind behind the events that had unfolded, behind the letters, the threats, and the calculated manipulation, had not been one of them. It had been someone else, someone who had played a much darker game, one that only Poirot had been able to decipher. Dr. Richter's face had gone pale. Anna Sims seemed to shrink into herself, her gaze flickering uneasily toward the others. Ivanov stood tense, his hands clenched at his sides, a mixture of anger and fear dancing across his features. They were all in shock, unable to fully grasp the magnitude of what Poirot had just laid bare. "Monsieur Poirot," Dr. Richter finally stammered, his voice shaking. "What do you mean? Who are you talking about?" Poirot allowed the silence to stretch a moment longer, letting the group stew in their uncertainty. Then, with deliberate calm, he spoke. "The mastermind," Poirot said, his voice low and steady, "is none other than your trusted confidant, Mademoiselle Sims." The words struck the room like a thunderclap, and for a moment everything seemed to stop. Anne Sims went pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. She took a half-step back, as if physically recoiling from the accusation. "You—" she began, her voice barely a whisper, but Poirot continued, unfazed by the shock in her voice. "Yes, mademoiselle," Poirot continued. "The letters you hid, the manipulation, the games you played with Dr. Richter, it was all part of a larger scheme. You were working with someone outside this room, someone who had a vested interest in ensuring this expedition failed. And you knew more than you let on. Anne shook her head violently, her hands trembling as she fought to maintain her composure. "No, you're wrong. I didn't—" Poirot raised a hand to silence her. "You believed you were clever, hiding the letters, keeping the truth to yourself. But your actions betrayed you, mademoiselle. The storm, the theft, the threats, they were all orchestrated to create fear, to push everyone to the edge, and you, like the others, were pawns in this game. But your role was the most pivotal. You were the one who had the power to derail this entire operation, and you used it." The room was silent for a long time as Anne stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing as though she were searching for words that never came. Poirot, his face unreadable, glanced once more at the group. "Justice," he said softly, "will be served. The truth always comes to light. You may not have known it, but this was your fate from the beginning. The game is over." As he spoke, Anne's shoulders slumped, her defeat evident. The mastermind had been unmasked, but it wasn't just Anne who was left to face the consequences. The others, too, were entangled in this web of deception. Poirot turned to the others, his expression softening just slightly. "Now we can leave this place, but remember this, no matter how far you run, the truth will always find you." The fire crackled, and for the first time in days, the group felt a flicker of relief. The game had ended, and justice, though delayed, had finally been delivered. Chapter 18, The Closing Remark. The storm outside had begun to subside, the once deafening howls of wind now reduced to a distant murmur. Inside the cabin, the oppressive silence lingered, though the weight of its tension had lifted. The truth had been revealed, and with it came the finality of justice. Anne Sims, the mastermind behind the web of deceit, stood motionless, her face ashen, her eyes vacant. The others watched her, their expressions a mixture of disbelief, anger, and resignation. Poirot stood at the center of the room, his demeanor composed and unruffled, as though nothing had transpired beyond the ordinary course of a long investigation. He had unraveled the mystery with the precision of a skilled surgeon, exposing the hidden motives and deceptions that had kept them all trapped in this tangled mess. But now, with the last pieces of the puzzle in place, there was only one thing left to do: leave the storm behind and ensure that justice was carried out. "Everything has its conclusion," Poirot said quietly, his voice filled with the calm certainty that had guided him through this case from the very beginning. "Even the darkest of games must end, and the truth must be faced." Anne Sims, her head hanging low, did not respond. She had no words left, no defense for her actions. She had played her part in this elaborate scheme, but now it was time for her to face the consequences. Poirot turned his gaze toward the rest of the group, each of them still processing the revelation. "Monsieur Richter," Poirot said, his tone more gentle now, "you too have played your role in this, though perhaps unwittingly. The fear, the suspicion, it clouded your judgment. But now the truth is clear." Dr. Richter looked up, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. He nodded slowly, the weight of his guilt apparent. "I should have known," he muttered, his voice strained. "I should have seen the signs." Poirot smiled faintly, the faintest trace of compassion in his eyes. "You are not alone in that, monsieur. We all missed the signs, but the important thing is that we now understand the full picture." Turning his gaze to Ivanov, Poirot added, "And you, Monsieur Ivanov, you were quick to panic, but in the end, you too were a victim of circumstance. Fear has a powerful hold over people, does it not?" Ivanov, who had been watching the exchange with a mixture of guilt and confusion, nodded silently.
I I didn't know what to do. I thought I could escape the truth. But now it's all clear. Poirot nodded once, his eyes briefly flicking to Anne, who had not moved since her final admission. The game is over. The storm has passed and we are left to face the consequences. The group stood in quiet contemplation, the air now lighter, though still tinged with the shadows of the ordeal they had just endured. Poirot turned to Anne, his gaze no longer filled with suspicion, but with the finality of understanding. "Mademoiselle Sims," Poirot said softly, "you have hidden your true intentions well. But as always, the truth finds its way into the light. It may not absolve you, but it has brought closure." He turned back to the others, his gaze sweeping the room. "There are no more games to be played, no more secrets to be uncovered. What is left now is the path toward justice and resolution." Poirot stood tall, his expression serene but firm. "I will leave you to reflect on what has transpired here. But remember, the truth always has its way of making itself known, and that, my friends, is the most powerful force of all." The fire crackled one last time, and in the soft glow of the cabin's flickering light, the storm outside seemed to finally give way to the quiet of the night. The game was over. Chapter 19. Epilogue. The storm had finally passed. The winds that had once howled relentlessly against the cabin's fragile walls now faded into a whisper, leaving behind a haunting silence. The snow, once a swirling mass of chaos, had settled into a cold stillness, blanketing the landscape in a peaceful, unnerving white. It was as though the world outside had been reset, restored to its natural order. But inside the cabin, the aftermath of the storm still lingered, and its effects would be felt for much longer. Poirot sat by the fire, his gaze fixed on the flames as they flickered and danced in the hearth. He had given his final verdict. Mastermind had been revealed, and with it, the weight of their actions had been brought to light. Anne Sims, the architect of the deceit, had been apprehended, but not without a price. The cabin was quieter now, the once tangible tension having dissipated with the conclusion of the case, but the damage to their lives was irreversible. Dr. Richter had retreated into a corner of the room, his face pale and drawn. His involvement, though indirect, had cost him the trust of his companions. The group's unity had shattered under the weight of their shared guilt, each person bearing the scars of their own actions. Viktor Ivanov was no exception. His desperate attempt to flee, his failure to reconcile with his own fears, had left him scarred, a reminder of how easily one could break under pressure. As for Anne, the mastermind herself, she sat in silence, her eyes hollow and vacant. The truth had unraveled her, leaving her with no more excuses, no more manipulation. She had been a puppet, pulled by invisible strings, yet it was clear now that she had known what she was doing all along. There was no redemption for her here, only the bitter taste of regret, one she would carry with her long after the storm had ended. Poirot's eyes flickered to the window, his sharp mind still working, piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle. He could see the snow outside, a stark reminder of the isolation they had endured. But even now, as the storm receded, the memory of it would remain in their minds. "It is over, but the shadows remain," Poirot murmured to himself, more to the room than anyone in particular. Anne looked up at him, her eyes hollow, filled with an emptiness that spoke volumes. She had been caught in the web of her own making, and now, in the aftermath, there was only the cold truth to face. "Will you ever trust again, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked, his voice soft but laden with meaning. Anne did not answer. She didn't have to. The silence spoke louder than any words could. Poirot stood and made his way to the door.
The others remained behind, lost in their thoughts, unsure of what came next. The storm had passed, but its effects would linger for a long time. Poirot had done his job. The truth had come to light. Now all that was left was for them to rebuild, to find a way to move forward from the wreckage. And as Poirot stepped into the calm after the storm, he knew one thing for certain. Truth, though delayed, had a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deep it was buried.